My name is Isabella Hoffbauer, and the date today is September 9th, 2020. So today I will be talking about the regulation of the gastric phase. I think it is important to note that there are three phases of digestion, the first one being cephalic, the second being gastric, and the third being intestinal. Of course, today we're only going to be talking about the gastric phase, but it is important to note that all of these phases of digestion are very connected and intertwined. So the gastric phase is the phase in digestion where swallowed food and semi-digested protein activate gastric activity. So the initiation of the gastric phase has to do with a series of steps, which I thought this image from the Silverthorne textbook chapter 21 outlined nicely for us. So the gastric phase starts when food enters the stomach from the esophagus. So once the food is entering the stomach from the esophagus, that is where that's where the cephalic phase ends, excuse me. So when food enters the stomach, there are short reflexes that are initiated by distension or peptides and amino acids. These short reflexes then activate endocrine cells and enteric neurons. You can see in this diagram that starts in the lumen of the stomach, where the short reflexes are initiated by distension or peptides and amino acids, which then takes the sensory input into the gastric mucosa, which then goes into the enteric plexus, which then goes to the postganglionic, parasympathetic, and intrinsic enteric neurons. After this all happens, these hormones, neurotransmitters, and paracrine molecules influence secretion and motility. Again, you can see this in the diagram, that these neurons lead to the target cells in the gastric mucosa, which then influence secretion and motility in the lumen of the stomach. So it is important to note that it is the parasympathetic neurons that we're talking about in the phases of digestion. This is because when parasympathetic is happening in the body, that is when the digestion system has the most blood flow, and the blood flow to like the skeletal muscles and other tissues that aren't working as hard, that's where all this more blood is going. So we wouldn't want the sympathetic to be activated, because that is our flight or fight response, where the blood is not really going to the digestive organs, it's going to our skeletal muscles and, get away from whatever threat that is happening to us. So an interesting part of digestion is that the stomach stores part of the food, and it's very important. So the top part of the stomach holds the food while the lower stomach digests the food. The relaxing and expanding of the stomach to hold this food is called the receptive relaxation reflex. Like I said, all of this is really important to digestion, because if it were not for the stomach holding part of the food, like a lot of excess food would end up in the small intestine. And the small intestine isn't designed for a huge amount of food to enter it, or chyme, as I should say. And so part of the role of the small intestine is to absorb all the nutrients from the food back into the body, so that there is not as much feces, like we're not just excreting all of this nutrients that we have. But if the stomach, we're not storing this food so that like little bits would enter the small intestine, more chyme would end up in the large intestine, and the large intestine isn't designed to absorb nutrients like the small intestine is. So then all this excess chyme would go in there, which would create excess feces, which then would lead to diarrhea. And of course, we don't want diarrhea because then the body is becoming dehydrated and cannot function normally. So gastric secretions are a huge part of the gastric phase of digestion. Their main roles are to protect the stomach and digest the food in the stomach. It is important to know that these secretions, let me go back a couple slides, are coming from this lumen part of the stomach. So the lumen of the stomach is lined with a mucus-producing epithelium, which then has openings from gastric pits. And inside the gastric pits are gastric glands. And different cells within these glands produce these various gastric secretions. So now we're going to talk about all the different gastric secretions. So first off, we have gastrin, which is a hormone that is secreted into the blood by the G cells. It can also be released by the gastrin-releasing peptide. And the stimulation of gastrin is produced by the distension in the stomach or by amino acids and peptides. And like I mentioned a few slides back, that's a huge reason why a lot of these gastric secretions are being stimulated. Its main role is to produce acid release. So then the secretion of acid, hydrochloric acid to be specific, is caused by parietal cells. Stomach acid has many functions, and such as the release and activation of pepsin, the trigger release of somatostatin, or to trigger release of somatostatin from D cells, to denature proteins for digestion, to kill bacteria and microorganisms, and to inactivate salivary amylase. Then there are two enzymes that are secreted in the stomach, which is pepsin and gastric lipase. Pepsin is secreted by chief cells, and they digest proteins. And gastric lipase helps to break down triglycerides. And it's important to know that these two enzymes are co-secreted, so they're secreted together. So finally, we have the paracrine secretions, which include histamine, intrinsic factor, and somatostatin. Histamine is a signal secreted by enterochromaffin-like cells, or ECL cells, in response to gastrin or acetylcholine stimulation. And the job of histamine is to stimulate acid secretion when combining with the H2 receptors on the parietal cells. Intrinsic factor, on the other hand, is a protein that is secreted by parietal cells that combine with B12 to help with vitamin absorption later on the intestine. And I'd like to point out that that is a connection to the last part of digestion, was the intestine part of digestion. So that's kind of where some of the connections come from with the different phases of digestion. And finally, somatostatin is secreted by D cells as a part of the negative feedback cycle for gastric phase of secretion. So this diagram, also taken from chapter 21 of the Silverthorne textbook, kind of shows what I've been talking about with all of these different cells, see in the lumen of the stomach, and the release of them. So food or cephalic reflexes initiated gastric secretion of gastrin, histamine, and acid. Gastrin stimulates acid secretion by direct action on parietal cells or indirectly through histamine. glial cells, and then somatostatin release by H plus in the negative feedback signal that molecules modulates acid and pepsin release. So that is kind of that whole diagram of what we were just talking about. Lastly, it is important to talk about the balance of the stomach. So the gastric mucosa helps to avoid autodigestion from acid and enzymes. So since the stomach is very powerful and all the secretions from the stomach are very harsh. I mean, we want them to be harsh because we want all of our food to be digested and we want all the nutrients from the food. The gastric mucosa has mucus cells that avoid this autodigestion from acid to the enzymes. So the mucus cells produce mucus and bicarbonate to create a mucus bicarbonate layer or barrier to protect from the acid and enzymes, basically and digesting all of our important cells that we need for digestion. It is important to note that when the stomach is irritated, there's more mucus being produced in order to calm this irritation and protect the stomach. I also found it interesting in the reading of Silverthorne that the pH of cell surface is 7, which is very basic and not what you would expect in the stomach, and the pH in the lumen is 2, which is what we would expect because there is hydrochloric acid and all these other acids being produced in the stomach. So this pH difference here is a lot what keeps the cell surface and all these other important cells for digestion to be autodigested. And then here are my sources, the Silverthorne textbook. Thank you for listening.